Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at the top of page 1249, Aleph Resh Mem Tes. I'm going to review it, of course. So on one end, the Rebbe Rashab is summing up and I don't say concluding, but has already filled the picture in about the development and the maturation and growth of a person's Avodah through the mind, cognitive and emotional faculties of the Nefesh Elikis, which also reflects the general growth of a human being, the 3 stages, Mutfa, Murgish, Muskel, or otherwise also called Ibur, Yanik, and Moichin, beginning from the behavioral, reflexive, instinctive, to defined and deliberate emotions, cognitive, directed by the cognitive emotions, all the way up to the higher levels of Bina and Chochma, Gadlus Ima, Gadlus Abba, as he emphasized on page, the Gadlus of both of them, page 1230, and ultimately reaching a point of B'chol Meodecho, which isn't just emotions that are born from intellect, from contemplation, but and not just the lower level of thirst, that is still mostly primarily an emotional experience, but one also that completely consumes the human being, heart and mind, completely delving and immersed in the greatness of godliness and the fact that he cannot live without it, as he made it very clear. And that in turn, you find that the emotions elevate the mind to the point that the mind achieves and innovates and is able to reach deeper levels of consciousness and even super consciousness, because Chochma and Bina is elevating from its motherly state of being a mother to the Midas, nurturing them and guiding them, to becoming in the same stature with the father, Chochma and Bina, gazing at Arich, drawing from Atik, and the deepest levels of Primis Atzmus Ein Sof. So that's like the ultimate level. And there too, everything gets transformed, even though it's a very internal experience and not as expressive as the lower level of B'chol Meodecho, which is louder and expansive and so on. Okay. Now, so the final piece we learned yesterday was how, the final piece in the paragraph on page 1248, I should say, is that this Gadlus HaMoichin is being drawn, as he uses the words. Just want to use the exact words. So in Zohar Ampen, not Arich Ampen, is radiating the Gadlus HaMoichin, the Abba, which means that Kavana Primisha B'Meich Begili Gam B'Lev, that the inner intention which is carried in the Moyach is revealed also in the heart. And he compared that, and he said, Yeshlemer, that's the halachas of Teresh Baal Peh, having it not just the regular level of Meichin Shaykh L'Midas, the revealed reason of Nigla, but also the Seid and the Primis, as it was by Rashbi, through his Bechat Katir Iskatarna, through his B'chol Meodecho, he was able to see even in the very basic levels of Torah law, the deepest levels from the divine, from the highest levels. And then he says, and then not just in Zoh, but also in Malchus. And on the contrary, in Malchus is the ultimate purpose of it all, to draw down all the way down, to give birth to Neshamas Chadoshes. And that's the Tachas HaKavana, to be in Malchus. HaTorah She'otrele Imoy. The crown, and I should have mentioned yesterday, but I'll say now, crown is Keser. Not just Chochma. It's Arich and Atik. And She'otrele Imoy, that Ima, Bina, gives it to the Chosin Zoh B'yem Chasanose. So what do we see from that? That the Amshacha B'Zoh is for Malchus Dafka. When do you get this Amshacha of the Keser in Zoh, in the Chosin, in the groom, is only when it's B'yem Chasanose, when he's ready to go down to Malchus, not when he's on his own. When Zoh is on its own level, or Zoh is receiving from Chochma and Bina, from Bina, then you don't get the Torah. It's only because of Malchus, that's when you get the highest level. And he said, that's the Hamshacha of Eir in the halachas of Teresh Shabal Peh. Bal Peh, Peh is Malchus. Yeah, and what are you drawing from? Moichila Stima, which is Atara de Gvura. And he says that Moichila Stima is Moichid Atika. So you're drawing all the way from the crown, the Moichid, the mind of Atik, being drawn all the way into Zoh because of Malchus. So you see from this, the Tachlis HaKavon is Malchus. So it's in Zoh, Misham Huamshach B'chinas Malchus, and Malchus also indicates the Kiyum Teira Mitzvahs B'Poel. So Teira Shalapeh, in Teira, it's the Teira that's negated to Halacha, which comes downward. Halacha is not just Lasukah Shmaita Libet de Hilchas, not just learning a concept, a theory, but Halacha. And in Kiyum HaMitzvahs B'Poel Mamash B'Kabol Sel Machos Shamayim, the Shuv that comes after the Rotze. And that's Va'ata Yigdal No Koyach Adnei, so you see now that the deepest level of godliness is given in order to draw it down. It's given dafka through mitzvahs, which means kima mitzvahs, not just through contemplation and midas, which is chabad and chagas, but all the way down to malchus. So now you see two things, that the highest levels are drawn to malchus, and it's Malchus that's actually drawing them down, because that's the ultimate purpose. Similar to what he said about the Midas before, that the Midas elevate Bina, and in turn, the Moichin then are drawn into the deepest level of Moichin, of Gadlus, is drawn into Zoh, into the Midas. Okay. Then the next paragraph that we learned, or began learning, we're middle of it, is really taking all of this and now establishing that this whole process that we just talked about doesn't happen on its own. Let's go back to the human being. A child is born with a natural inherent faculties. Moichin, midas. It's impulsive, or it's instinctive, and hardwired emotions are not due to the Avodah. There's no work necessary. In the level of Ibur, or the level of Mutfa, we learned that comes natural. There's no effort there. You could say in Avodah, there's a little effort. At least you're doing something behaviorally, even though you may not have full emotions in it, like he brought from chapter 16 in Tanya. But essentially, it's without Avodah. That's how we are. A child doesn't need to make any effort and to deliberately feel, let's say, love or pain. That's natural. Just giving it as an example. So the same thing he's discussing now. So how does it grow? The growth comes, in our case, we're not talking about the natural growth of a child. We're talking about the growth that comes through a deliberate effort called Avodah. So what the Rebbe Rashab is addressing, and I'm elaborating a bit more than we spoke yesterday, is what comes naturally and what comes through work. So I'm going to go over what we learned. So he said, this level of maturity, we have come to these highest levels of Moichin de Gadlus, not just a Moichin that is like Bina taking care of its young, the mind regulating or guiding the emotions. But Moichin de Gadlus, these highest levels of Moichin de Gadlus, the truth is even Bina guiding the young is also Avodah, I should say. But relatively speaking, the highest levels, it's Ikar shemamshichim al yedei Avodah. That's the Ikar. That's the main thing that Avodah is necessary. Because lower levels, you also have a certain natural progression, a natural growth. But the primary place, he says, to reach these highest levels. So now the elder Rebbe Rashab says, but there's a question. Elsewhere it's explained that the Tachlis Avodah will hamshich moichin lezun. To be mamshich moichin lezun, which is what we're discussing here. Actually, I should correct myself. The Arizal actually supports this point, because in Kisra Arizal it says that the ultimate Avodah, Tachlis Avodah, is to draw down moichin to zun, and that's what Avodah does. So both Gadlus HaMoichin and Moichin and Tezun is all through Avodah. And here the Rebbe Rashab asked the question, V'haloi, But isn't it the case that moichin goes to midas even based on the very structure of the cosmic order? Let's go back to an example I gave with a child. Even if there was no avodah, even if there was no effort to serve God with your mind and emotions, a child of 1 year old, a newborn or a 1 year old is not comparable to a 10-year-old. There's a natural growth even if you don't do anything. The mind of a human being is going to become more mature and in effect will be able to regulate and guide emotions, even if you do nothing. So then why do we say that the ikar is the avodah? So he says, I'm giving the example below of a child and an adult, but in the cosmic order, Meichin goes to Zun. That's the natural process. God created 10 spheres. Is Chochma, Bina, Das. Then comes Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Ched, Yesod, Malchus. And the order is Meichin goes into Midas. There's no Avodah necessary. That's the way the order is. Just like you plant a seed in the ground, the tree will grow. Or there's a natural growth even without planting a seed. So there's no Avodah altogether. There's a natural process of development and growth, and moichin and tamid is based on seder shtalshus. So what is new being done in this hamshachas hameichin that you're saying is coming through avodah? So his answer is that there's two levels. There's the natural moichin that goes into midas, which is in seder shtalshus called chitzenius hameichin. An outer dimension is instilled in the system. And he says, in general, that's called moichin di yanika, moichin di ima, the moichin of bina. That's a natural process where the mind has a certain element of impact on the emotions. In Kabbalah, it's called nihi di ima, the lower level of ima nihi, nase moichin lezah, become the mind of zah. That's natural. That does not require avodah. And that comes from the yichud chitzeni, the abba ve'ima. What causes that transmission from bina to zah? That's through a yichud chitzeni, which means I don't want to call it superficial, but a surface level union between chochma and bina, again, which happens naturally. And he called that also the level of yesod saba v'tfuna, which is a Kabbalistic term for this yichud chitzeni, the outer yichud. The yichud zeh nasa ma'atzmai shaloi al yidei avodaseinu. This yichud is happening. God set up a system that happens without any work, our effort, or our service below. And he brings some commercial kosev Radiates Chaim ba'agdoma b'shara krishma perikei. So, but then he qualifies that it does say there in Radiates Chaim that you don't to create this this union, the outer union of Chochma and Bina, which in turn causes the moichin diyanika, a limited flow of moichin, of intellect, to go into the midas. He says the avodah is rak lahamshich hagilim misham zeh makol mokum al yidei avodah. To draw that gilui, in order for us to benefit from it. Or not necessarily us. Lahamshach gili, that's the avodah, is to draw it. But the actual union and the actual connection is natural. And he says to look, Commercial Kosev Seif Perikei, I'd have to look in Radiates Chaim to see exactly how he spells that out. So in other words, there is avodah, but the avodah is more just to draw it, not to create it. But now comes the ikar avodah. The primary power of avodah is lahamshach b'chinas meichin the gadlus, not meichin the yanika, not the meichin a narrow flow nursing the midas from bina, but meichin the gadlus. And this hamshacha eina b'seder ishtalshus mashanim the dalpimaymer kavamida. This was not there existent in the structure that God put into place that allows the flow from one level to the next. This is not there. This is a new energy, a new transmission that comes from the source, meaning the source higher than that which was designated for creation. And that's dafka avodah. V'zeu mamshichim dafka ad avodah. b'mesiras nefesh. Not just Avodah, but Avodah b'mesiras nefesh. Like he brings from the Lekutei Torah, Bir Digdashti, as I mentioned yesterday, referred to. Because a lot of this is based on page 1236. A lot of it is based on that mimer. And he says clearly, the Hainush idea, Avodah b'pnimis v'atzmus haneshama, mamshichim b'pnimis pnimis v'atzmus ein sof. So it's tit for tat, mida connected mida. It's cause and effect. If it's a natural flow, then you need a little Avodah, but you don't need to create something new. You don't have to reach and do an Avodah on such a deep level. The more you want to reach higher levels, the deeper you have to reach within yourself, because it's basically connected to one another. So through our mesiras nefesh, in pnimis ve'atzmus haneshama, which he says, the next line is the Avodah b'chol Meodecho, sha'izei zeh dafka mamshichim b'chinas meichen degadlus. So now you're getting a higher level of meichin of elikus that you would never get without the Avodah, based on the regular flow of Seder Shtalshlus, which of course explains, like I discussed yesterday, the whole purpose of why we're here on this earth. If all this is happening on its own, well, who needs us? What does our work do? So to go back, you could already see that he's already, even though he didn't say it, we're going to be talking about Gan Eden. We learned in the Parsha Bereishis, what we learned? God created Gan Eden, then he put Adam and Chava there, and he said, La'avda l'shamar, you should serve and protect this garden, which of course means Avodah of Torah mitzvahs and so on. Now, who created the garden? God created the garden. The human being serves, his Avodah, La'avda, is to make the garden grow and blossom more than what would naturally have been there. In other words, if you read the Parsha, it's very straightforward, it's very direct. It even says God put into this garden every type of tree. So they came into a garden that was not a wilderness, was not a desolate wilderness. It was a garden with trees, a beautiful garden, like he says. And yet, the Avodah of Adam and Chava was to make this garden grow much greater than it would be on its natural level. This is exactly what he's saying here. So you have both levels of moichin as it's part of the flow of Seder Shtalshlus, and then there's more, and then there's what we add. Going back to the example I gave, so a child will grow into an adult no matter what. I mean, unless God forbid something happens, but in general, it will grow to adult. As an adult, it will have more of a mature mind and mature midas, even without a drop of Avodah. Now, what happens if there is Avodah? You control your impulses and you grow in your mind, you can reach levels far, far more than anyone would ever reach naturally. So if you look at a 30, 40-year-old that did no Avodah, or a 30, 40-year-old that did Avodah, the Avodah is going to be a far level of maturity and discipline, and even reaching deeper levels. It would be like saying someone may be born with a genius mind, and they make no effort. They naturally understand things well, they pick things up quickly. But imagine then another person who has that, but also makes effort and exerts themselves in learning. So both have the same IQ, so to speak. They both have the same natural aptitude of intellect, but one is going to be far and completely, not even quantitative, qualitatively different place because of their effort and exertion. Because it will draw out much more from the potential of these faculties that the person who has the natural talent or the natural intelligence will not achieve, will not reach. This is explained at length in Samach Vav, where he talks about what yigia, when we make an effort and exert ourselves, it reaches deeper into Chochma Tima to reveal even deeper ideas. Both yigia and the second thing, Kabbalah Sale, that he mentioned as well here, Kabbalah Sale. In other words, you don't just do it based on how much logical it is to you, but you do it because you need to do it, and it's the Gei Benefesh. So you can imagine, as he said, the haskalas, the ideas of the mind will go far, far deeper than somebody who's just doing it in a, so to speak, in a casual or without an effortless type of way.
How could a human mobile dika person reach these heights?
As I said, every class I say almost, everyone has to find in their own life examples of this. We say every day, B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meodecho. So you have to, I'll rephrase the question. What is your b'chol avavcha? What's your chol nafshecha, chol meodecho? What do you think about? So most of us, unfortunately, we just read the words. It's called lip service. But if you really even give Pirush HaMilas a kavana of just even the interpretation, so I've given many examples for this time and again. He said, b'chol avavcha is that your heart is feeling a connection, a love toward godliness. B'chol nafshecha, it also affects your faculties. Meaning like rotz ledvar mitzvah, that after davening, you actually go and run to do a mitzvah. You are motivated. And b'chol meodecho is doing more than you naturally would do. If you naturally, let's say, you learn Perek Echad, you learn 2 prakim. You learn for 5 minutes a day, you start learning 10 minutes a day. You give $5 for charity, you give $10 instead. What he says in Perek Tezvav in Tanya, that you move to a place that's beyond your comfort zone, even in Kedusha. So there's always that growth of Mailam B'Kedesh. So that is on a very basic level, these levels, but it's obviously not the highest levels as he describes them here, but relative to you, like the story with Abzusha, what's going to be demanded is whether you or you, not you or someone else. So Bedakus in Zohar Ampin, everybody has these different levels. You just have to find them within you. And that's really a process of personal Avodah, which I suggest speaking to your mashpia and saying, how do you translate this into your life based on your levels in life? That's what I would say. Now, what Meichen de Gadlus again is relative. It's all relative. Meichen Shaykh Lemidus means the Meir that relates more to your needs and to your subjective needs. Meichen de Gadlus, as he said, is more focusing on God that's beyond you. Now, the level of Negei B'Nafshei, this too, I don't know if a person can achieve that easily 24/7, but there are times, like by Ne'ilah, when we say Baruch Hashma and Baruch Shem and Havayu Lekim, it says there a person should be mechaven as they're being meisen nefesh mamish to God. Now, it doesn't say that every day, because then at that moment you can expect many people have a Yisraelus. Does it last? It's another question. But each of us can evoke at times this level. The question is how much you could become a regular. Can you, every time you say Shema, you're supposed to be limser nafshe be'echad. That's what it says. To give your life in the word echad when you say Shema Hashem echad. And then that translates into v'ahavta b'chol meodecho. So I think it's a matter of finding in your own personal life somewhere where you have that absolute commitment more than the regular one regulated by intelligence. B'chol avavcha b'chol nafshecha is more, the seichel is telling the midas that this is the right thing to do, and the midas follow along to some extent. B'chol meodecho is going, that we're doing this completely for God, complete dedication. And I think there are times that all of us can be in the zone, if you wish. I think when a shliach makes a decision to do the Rebbe's shlichus instead of taking care of their own needs, but that, in a certain way, that commitment is a certain mesiras nefesh, because it's much easier to go into business and take care of yourself. And from time to time, you'll give tzedakah, you'll learn Chassidus, you'll do some iftzayim. But to give your life and move to a place. Now, I'm not saying every shliach does it with the highest level of mesiras nefesh. It's also very popular. So fine, shalei l'shma. But the idea of dedicating your life to kedusha and Torah mitzvahs and afotzah sameyonos chutza is a certain expression of this. I mean, I can go on and on in different examples, but I think each of us have to find something where you can experience a more of a commitment to Hashem and His kavanah more than how Hashem serves your needs. Like when you say Birchas Hamazon or any Birchas Hanenin, where you're thanking God, you're blessing God for something you benefit, that is beautiful, but it's still a God on your terms. When you do something on God's terms, that's not just about you and your structure, then you're going out of Seder Ishtalshus of your own being, and that in turn will draw something. B'chol Meodecho, Moed Shelcha, Chassidus says, brings down the Moed Amiti. That's how the Eibishter made it. The Min HaMeitzah Karasi Ka has to be L'fiyerech you. So this is already translating Ayin Beis into personal terms to find ways that you can bring this into a way that fits. I would even say a child. The Rebbe in many sichos to Tzivus Hashem always said, or many times he said, that the ideas, even the deepest ideas of Chassidus, can be explained to a child too, l'fiyerech. When you tell a child that today you're going to do some tzedakah, do a little more than yesterday, reach out to another person. So very on a small level that the child can understand, the child is going to more than their natural structure, which is what he's essentially saying here. Seder Ishtalshelus is the structure. Avodah goes beyond the structure within you, and in turn draws from Elikuz that's higher than Seder Ishtalshelus, from the previous Atzmus. So that's on a basic level. Okay. Are there any questions about the summary? Because if not, I'm going to continue on line 4 on page 1249. So let's continue. The line begins, so the Rebbe Rashab continues. Now, in this gadlus Abba that radiates in Zah, we can say, and this is going to be key here to tying all this up together, because now we've established that Avodah draws down these higher levels. So he says, "Be'inyan gadlus Abba that radiates in Zah, yeshlem." You can say, "Tehine Chochma nikra seichel hanelam, shalamaylam b'chinas seichel hamusig." So Chochma is 2 levels in seichel. Seichel hamusig. That means an idea that's understood. That's usually bina. Seichel hanelam is also seichel. We're not talking about higher than seichel, but it's a seichel hanelam. It's concealed. And he quotes this from Tanya. So in Tanya, chapter 18, where he talks about that the neshama of a id has a ava misoteres, has a deep connection that's deeper than just a logical connection. So he quotes that. It comes from Chochma, and Chochma is called Seichel Hanela. So we see these 2 levels in Seichel, which is higher than the Seichel HaMusig. This is not to be confused with Chochma Stima. Chochma Stima is also called, Stima means Helam too, means concealed. But actually, Stima means closed up, sealed, because that's super consciousness. Chochma is already in your conscious state, an akuda, but it's called Seichel Hanela because the Seichel is not yet developed and fully fleshed out. Now, of course, Chochma Gluya is a Keli and is rooted in Chochma Stima. But he's saying the following. Let's see where he's going with this. Ukamoy shemer b'midas, and how Seichel Chochma radiates in midas, hainu shemer b'hem ha-Seichel, eich de les machshava tvisa klal be'erein sabaruchu. I'll change the niggin. I said it the wrong way. And this Seichel Hanelam of Chochma, the way it radiates in Midas, what does that mean? What's radiating? Since it's Seichel. Shemer b'ma Seichel Eich, which Seichel? Not the Seichel that you understand something. The Seichel, the less machshava tfisa klal be'erein sabaruchu. That no thought cannot grasp Erein sabaruchu. Because Erein Sof is higher than any type of thought. Less machshava tfisa beklal. K'im bittul ha'asaga. But rather, what do you experience when you know this? Bittul ha'asaga. I'll explain in a minute. Just give me a minute. Like explains in the beer of Mimona, which is the Maimed, I think L'Kutei Teira Polok, v'nizbar li'il, and was explained above. Okay. This is very dense. I just want to say before I explain, you may have noticed this, or maybe you didn't notice it. Since we've been learning volume 3, which where the Rebbe Rashab did not go over volume 3. Remember, we discussed, just something important to point out, in the early volumes, till Teruma Ayin Hey, the Rebbe Rashab wrote the whole Hemshech, but then he broke them down into Maimorim, which means he went over it again. He added beginnings and ends, and reviewed and edited the whole manuscript again. Then a third stage, he went back and made chapters and summaries till Teruma Ayin Hey, middle of volume 2, basically. So he went over at least 1, 2, 3. Right? Let me say everything and I'll explain, because please, We made an agreement. People want to hear.
I want to know.
I don't want to answer anything until I finish. It's not a conversation between me and you. There are people complaining. I'm telling you. There are people online here that are learning this, and it's confusing them. And then it's also recorded, and people have told me they're listening. They want to hear the flow. So let me finish. Write down your question. If I don't answer it in my speaking, I'll answer it afterwards. What's the big thing? Why can't we just do it in that manner? It just makes it easier for other people. I'm just asking. Kosher nafshis. So, till Truma Ayin Hey, that's what he did. So based on that, 1, 2, 3, 4, there were at least 4 edits that the Rebbe Rashab did. After Truma Ayin Hey in volume 2, the Rebbe Rashab stopped. It was due to time, obviously, because this was all taking time. So you only have Maimorim, and you don't have chapters or summaries. This goes all the way to the end of volume 2, which we learned, which is Vayera Tofre Shayin Vov. And so we have the Maimorim, which means that he went over at least 2 times, maybe 3 times. Then that's when the Rebbe Rashab left Lubavitch, never to return, right after Tishrei, after Vayera Tofre Shayin Vov, which is equivalent to the year 1915, and moved to Rostov. Volume 3 continues that flow, but the Rebbe Rashab never went back to turn it into Maimorim, and definitely not into chapters and summaries. Now, this doesn't mean that this isn't all perfectly accurate, but if you look, and I did look at the way he edited earlier versions, the earlier parts of the Hemshech, Rebbe Rashab never edited this. So there are many sections here that you'll notice, far more than in the earlier volumes, that are very, very short. And he just says a point, like right now, a point, and I would conjecture, can't say for sure, that were the Rebbe Rashab to go over this, he may have added a whole piece, and it would have been written much more developed and much more fleshed out. So the points are here, but as you see, I've been stopping a lot more and explaining more, because he's referring to places and sometimes things we learned earlier, and he doesn't spell it all out. So that's why there are things here that are very, very dense, and they need much more explanation than in the earlier volumes. I just wanted to point that out. Then I'll explain this. Anybody, you want to ask something about what I just said? Okay.
You just answered my question.
So you see, if you're patient, questions are answered. Okay. Now, so now let's explain, what did the Rebbe Rashab just say here? It's like so my understanding of it, based on a number of earlier parts of the Hemshech Ayin Beis, and I'd still want to look up the Tanya, because anything the Rebbe Rashab refers to, rest assured, is part of the understanding of it, that you have the natural flow of Moichin Temidus, that we learned, that he called Moichin Dianike, which he called Moichin of Bina, that is Nimshach in Zah. And there does not need Avodah. It happens on its own. The only thing Avodah is that it draws it down or reveals it, but that is a natural process. Then there's a level that Avodah is Mamshech Moichin de Gadlus, what he calls Moichin Chidush, Hamshocha Chadosha. And that is only through Avodah. That Avodah of Mesiras Nefesh, B'chol Meodecho, that you reach deeper beyond your structure, and that draws down. How does that translate into Moichin and Temidus? So the natural Moichin and Temidus is not Gadlus Abba. That's a natural flow. That would be Bina, Seichel HaMusag. You contemplate and you meditate and you concentrate and comprehend something in Elokus. That's Bina. Bina then in turn trains and educates its young, the Midas. So to say there's no Avodah, there is some Avodah there, but it's not a major Chiddush, because that's the natural process. Our mother takes care of its young. So the Midas are being informed by Seichel HaMusag. But when the Avodah happens, that you've reached B'chol Meodecho, and the Midas have now been matured, and they're elevating Bina back to the level of Chochma, and they're drawing down Gadlus Abba, so he says that is you're drawing from Seichel HaNelam, not Seichel HaMusag, not from the regular comprehension you have, which is A natural. Every person has a measure, has an ability to concentrate, to comprehend godliness, to contemplate on it, and bring an emotion. That's b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. As we learned the Fedish earlier, he said it explicitly on page 1245. He said clearly, he said that shaboim rak min hatam ba'aseichel. It's not ava atzmis shebenefesh, because you didn't reach b'chol meidech ava atzmis. So that is seichel hamusik. But when you do b'chol meidecha, now you draw from seichel hanelam, which means a deeper level of seichel that you would not have on your own without the avodah. And what does that do to the midas? This is key. The midas in general, as we know, are driven by self-interest. And I don't mean negative self-interest now. We're not talking about a yetzer hara or a nefesh habamis. Just in general, a midah is a subjective entity. It's I like it, I don't like it. Seichel doesn't speak in terms whether what's in it for me or not. In other words, Avos Hashem, for example, is subjective. I love God. That means I'm drawn to it. I am connected and drawn. When you're learning it in the Seichel says it's worthy of loving God. God is a very great entity. But that type of personal connection, which begins with das and iskashus, and ultimately translates into a real midah. So midas in general are about you connecting to something. But we've learned throughout this whole 20 pages that midas themselves, there's levels. There's the midah, the natural midah we're born with. There's the midah as it's shaped and defined by seichel. There's a midah that's born from seichel, that the seichel gives birth to it and creates it. And then there are midas that are natural midas, like he says in Perek Yud Ches and Tanya, the very essence of a neshama, the Yisrael, that's connected to Hashem, like a child to a parent. But it's usually concealed. When B'chol Meodecho reveals it, not only reveals it, it's negei benefesh. Negei benefesh is a midah sprach, not a seichel sprach. When you say something is negei benefesh, it means it's emotional. In seichel, you don't say negei benefesh. But what you do is that what's negei benefesh to you emotionally will affect your seichel, like you said, to immerse itself and come up with all kinds of ideas of how to connect. When you really love someone and you're consumed with love, you're going to be thinking all the time, how can I do something for the one I love? Send them gifts, do this, do that, because you're consumed with it. But the love part is the connection. And the seichel part is the innovative element of seichel. So now, when a person comes to this level of b'chol meodecha, which means the midas have now reached a place that what's negei nefesh to them is not their own interest per se, but the connection to God, because they can't live without godliness. So in a way, it's an interesting mix of self-interest, but it's also beyond your self-interest. Because at the end of the day, it's not your self-interest because it's Hashem. It's not what the person itself wants. On the other hand, that's exactly who you are. It's the natural love of God, but as we learn, seichel adds a whole dimension to this, because it's not just the natural love, it also, the seichel, as he said, brings a whole element to it with the whole person, and their whole being is consumed with it, and their mind is able to reach places that emotions can never reach. This he made very clear when he spoke about what seichel adds on page 1246, the higher level of b'chol meodecha. So what does seichel do to the midas of, what does seichel do to the midas? Now that we have meichen de gadlus or gadlus abba, it teaches the midas something that the midah would never understand, would never relate to on its own. Eich de les machshava tfisa klal, only through bittul hasaga. So the midas, he says, shemeir b'midas and shemeir b'maseichel eich de les machshava tfisa beklal. So the midah on its own loves God, but the mind, the gadlus abba, is imbuing and instilling within the midas a sense, the sense how nothing can grasp him. Bina, the regular level of seichel hamusag, when Bina is educating the midas, there the midas are midas, they remain emotions, and Bina is training them that you use your emotions toward godliness. But when you reach this higher level of Avodah b'chol meodecha, Gadlus Abba is teaching the midah something much more. Not just that you should be directed toward God, but that the seichel is not seichel that's understandable. It's actually a seichel that's completely the opposite of musag. He says, a seichel, the less machshava tvisvei klal bittul hasaga. So it's like the opposite. Bina teaching me this is musag. It's not a bittul of hasaga. You understand godliness, and therefore you love God, but it's based on the seichel. Now we're talking about a higher level of bittul that comes dafka from godless Abba, the less machshava tvisvei klal be'ereis of baruch hu. What still needs explanation is what's the difference between the machshava, how the mind understands it and how the emotions experience it. So I would say, just to add one more point, that the difference is that when Bina is training the midas exist. They're not bottled by mitzias. They're just being guided, like we learned earlier, that Bina cannot create a shinui, a chidush in the midas. It can only guide and train them. In other words, that you should train that since God is great, and kula kamek kalachashiv, all the different reasons, that's why you should direct your emotions to loving God. But the emotions don't cease to be the way they were wired in you. We learned at the same time, Chochma, on the other hand, creates a bittul that you can actually go beyond your regular emotional connection to God, the natural instinctive connection. And that is most likely what he's saying here, that God l'sabbat through Avodah, which ironically or paradoxically is happening through B'chol Meodecho, the midas in turn, the midas affect, elevate the moichin to higher levels, and the moichin introduce into midah that it's not about you and your natural love of God, which is B'chol avavcha, B'chol nafshecha, or even the lower level of B'chol Meodecho, and a love, in other words, that is based on a seichel, but it's a love that's based on higher than seichel. And the midas themselves become sublimated, almost becoming opposite of their natural instinct of subjective, that they recognize something that's beyond musag, bittul hasaga, which is higher than the level of midas that are driven by hasaga. Because you're appreciating less machshava tfisa klal. That's what godless Abba does to the midas. But I want, before I stop for a discussion, the Rebbe Rashab then says, Gam yesh leimer, shezeu inyan tachlis hayidiyah shalei neda kanal. You could also say that this is the inyan, that the ultimate of yidiyah is not to know, is that you don't know, or to know the unknowable. So you would think, and I'll explain what this means, you would think that the mind can go to a place like that. A mind has the capacity to understand things, and as it grows, the greater the mind is, the more the mind understands how much it doesn't know. Even more than that, the mind can even sense the unknowable through shlila or whatever. But the midas, you could say the midas don't have that capacity. A midah either loves or doesn't love. It doesn't have the capacity. Either I recognize God that I love, or I don't. It's like you say to a human being. You could say the mind can imagine and can abstract to points that are beyond rational understanding. Like when we think about superconsciousness, or to use a scientific example, when you think about quantum states that are not logically structured, indeterministic states. I'm not saying it's exactly this level, but it means the mind can imagine, the mind can abstract. But emotions, you'd think emotions can love God, can love levels that are beyond you, but you can't say the emotions experience that. And here he's saying, yeah, that emotions don't just remain in their level. You can actually cause that the feelings of a person should feel, not just understand, that God is completely beyond any comprehension. So this is where the moichin are informing, godless Abba is informing the midas. So in other words, even on a midah level, not only the mind can reach high levels of God that are beyond gvul, beyond seder shtalshlus, but even midas, which seem to be the very wiring of who we are, can also, because they are rooted in Elokus, they also can reach. Remember, we said Zoh ba'atika achid detalya. So the midas themselves can also reach through moichin, through B'chol Meodecho, when the midas go beyond themselves, and which happens after Bina educates them. Then they reach a level of B'chol Meodecho. then the mind can then lift them to a place that the whole person experiences the levels of divine that are beyond any subjective structure. I think that's what he's really coming to say. That's the Chiddush here. But you see how brief it is, and without explanation, it's not clear. Now, the Tachlis idea Neda is clearly spelled out at the bottom of page 1247, and that's where I'm taking some of what I'm saying. But now, and that's when Elikus is negayah to him. But now you have both the midas, which on one hand are more about you. Meichen is more about higher than you. That the midas also can experience something that's greater than their own very structure. And of course, the mind has the other limitation. The mind on its own doesn't have Mesiras Nefesh. A mind is understanding things. Even when it goes to higher levels, it's still not negay benefesh. That comes from the midas. So the midas are informing the seichel, and the seichel are informing the midas, and you have a whole package here of entire human being, cognitive and emotional, that are all consumed with godliness that are beyond the structure of existence. And that's what happens through Avodah. I'm just going to finish till the end of the paragraph, then I'll stop for any questions. Ubezeir Bolok, Daf Reish Gimel Amid Beis, in page 203b, Al Posek Kimeresh Surim. Kimeresh Surim. So he touches Surim. Kimeresh Surim usually means the head of the mountains or the strongholds. Kimeresh Surim Erenon.
Head of the rocks. Sur is a rock.
Yeah. So he says in Zohar, Dot Siyura V'diyukna Da'avua Tisrashe Be'bamish. That's the image, the Shiur, and the yukna and the likeness of Avua, of his father, the Israshim Bei Mamish. It's like when Yosef saw and visioned his father, the Israshim Bei Mamish, that literally makes an impression literally in him. So he explains, what is that? That's Moichin the Abba. Meresh is Abba, Chochma, that creates an image. Avua is Chochma, is the father. So it doesn't just remain there, it actually impresses an image and a light in Zah. Like it says in the commentary, Migdash Melech on the Zohar, that Zohar, which is Zohar Ampin, Midas, comes similar to Abba, to his father. Like a little like we say Yitzchak was similar to his father, but here we're talking about Midas. Midas on their own, they're not Moichin. And yet, this whole development of the Midas has come to a point where the Midas is similar, becoming in the likeness of its father, because it's as literally envisioning. So even though the Midas are a child, but the child has matured to a point that he can be just like his father. And this type of moichin is only through Avodah. This does not come naturally. So to just make the point, drive the point home, as much as the Midas are fundamentally connected to their father, to God, but it's a child and not the father. But Meichin, the Abba, and Gadlus Meichin, which is able to comprehend really more than that, sense and resonating and envision godliness that's beyond the structure. Remember, Abba ve'Ima are gazing at Arich and drawing from Atik. That is being transmitted even to the very midas of the person. The conscious emotions are also experiencing in an experiential way, in a midas way, an emotional way, the divine that's beyond their natural wiring. That's what it sounds like he's saying. And this is dafke through Avodah. This is not just the natural process of growth that he discussed earlier, which is nimdad, measured according to Seder Ishtalshlus. So what still needs explanation is, if we say that a Jew, a neshama, is a chelik elikam emal mamish, and has a ava mesuteres atzmis, a fundamental love for God, is that what he's talking about? Or is he talking something even beyond that? In other words, the midas of the nefesh alikis are, I would venture to say that the midas of the nefesh alikis, or the midas that he's talking about here, is more the structural emotions. First, they're defined by seichel, and then they come to a point where they experience through seichel leads them to reveal their very essential nature that can only be through Mechin. It would never happen on its own, because on its own, they would remain on their subjective place. So essentially what he says in Perek Beis and Tanya, that the Chelik Elikam Mal Mamish then transmits Vayipach Ba'apov into like Me'etzem Moyech Ha'av, Bonim Atam L'Hashem Elokechem. But he says it comes through Chochma. Chochmasi is Baruch. In other words, it's not just the Atzmus Chelik Elikam Mal Mamish into the Neshama, it comes through Chochmasi is Baruch. He says that clearly there. Like a father, Reish Ha'av. So you see there that Chochma is a critical component in drawing down and also ultimately revealing the deeper level of the neshama's connection to the highest levels of godliness beyond the way its natural structure and say the ishtalshlus. So even as the neshama comes down below, it connects through Chochma, it connects all the way up to these highest levels. So it's very consistent with what he says in Tanya, obviously. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Any questions?
He's speaking about Chochma Nikro Seichel HaNelam Shelmala Mebchinas Seichel HaMusad. That means the Zivug Shlim, right? That this Chochma shines in the middles. Basically, Seichel HaMusad is Bino Oivetzas Alo Efroichim, but here he's talking that Seichel HaNelam, that means that the Bino is gazing together with the Chochma. I'm right or wrong?
Generally, it's on that level, but here the focus is more on the Hamshacha of Gadlus Abba back into Zah. What you're describing is that the Midas catapult Bina to stand side by side with Chochma, Abba Ve'ima Zivuga Shlim, and they gaze at Arech and Atik. But then remember, the next step is that it has to come back down. So here he's talking more on the down spiral, where that level of Chochma Bina, but mostly Chochma, the godless Abba is being drawn into Zah. So Seichel HaNelam is the level of Chochma here. He's not mentioning Bina. And
I understand.
So that's the way I would contextualize.
But the Bina is reaching this level. I don't see another way.
It doesn't say that here. That's not the part. That's we spoke about earlier. As I just said, stage one is the Midah, the Mitzur B'chol Meodecho elevates Bina. Like he said, Magbia, B'meichin, to go to the Etzem and gaze at Arich and Atik, and then it comes back down, like he said, the Kavanah is that it come down, that the Meichin informs the Zoh now. And that's what he's spelling out, the Godless Abba, not just Bina. Godless Abba, Seichel HaNelam is informing the Midas. That's where we're talking about now. So that's the flow.
Also, the Seichel HaNelam is higher than Chochmas Timor or lower?
I just discussed that it can be higher because it's Chochma Gluya here. He's not talking about Chochmas Timor. He says Seichel HaNelam, Chochma is called Seichel HaNelam. It's rooted in Chochmas Timor.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All good?
I think that was the deepest, Rabbi Jacobson, I think that was the deepest discussion I've ever heard of Avodah Panimis in my life. No? I mean, I've never heard, but like, I got two questions. A Klatz Kasha, first of all. This is obviously this whole Avodah that we're talking about, this whole process, is dealing with the Nefesh HaSichlis, correct? It's not talking about the Nefesh Elokis or...
It is the Nefesh Elokis.
It is within the Nefesh Elokis? I thought the whole thing
go
is
back. I'll show you. If you have the mimer in front of you, go back to page 1225. So he says, Adugma Makol Zeh Yuvan ben Neshama Elokis. Sheyesh ba Hagimel Madreges the Mutfa Murgish Muskel. Can you apply this also to Nefesh HaSichlis? Yes, you can, because Seichel also has, that's what Seichel has, but he began speaking in general, like maybe the Nefesh HaSichlis, or the natural person, but then he definitely connected it to Nefesh Elokis. But it's not a contradiction. What they're both correct. All these levels can be spoken about on all levels, but remember, you're talking about a natural love to God. The Nefesh HaSichlis does not have a natural love to God.
But I thought
Nefesh
that's the whole,
HaSichlis is very impartial. It's not a Nefesh Habamis, but it's also not Nefesh HaLekis.
but I thought
He's
that was
talking
the
here
whole,
about the Seichel of the Nefesh HaLekis. Sorry?
I thought that was the whole idea of all of making a Dira B'Tachtonim, which is what this is all about, is to transform the Nefesh HaSichlis and Nefesh HaBahamis. That's the
It's a
Avodah.
contradiction, but the Nefesh HaLekis has to go through its levels of Avodah to do that, what you just said.
Because I thought the Nefesh HaLekis
He's
on its
not
own
discussing
has
here the battle between the Nefesh HaLekis and Nefesh Habamis. He's not talking about transforming the animal soul here, or he's talking about the process of Avodah in a person that will give them the power to then use this as they deal with the Nefesh Habamis. You're asking there's different context. When you learn Tanya, chapter 2 through chapter 5 are all about the Nefesh HaLekis. Chapter 6 through chapter 8 is the Nefesh Habamis. And chapter 9, he comes and then says, now that we know what the Nefesh HaLekis is, the Nefesh Habamis, let's talk about their confrontation battles. But you need to have the Nefesh HaLekis is growing through these steps of its growth. Yes, in Inyan, when you say b'chol nafshecha, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, you say b'chol nafshecha, b'chol levavcha, b'shnei yitzarecha. You're also talking about transforming the animal soul, but the focus here is on the person's capacity to relate to and experience godliness. Now, does the Nefesh HaSichlis have that capacity? Yes. So you could apply these ideas also, but primarily he's talking about the Nefesh HaLekis.
It was my understanding that Nefesh HaLekis, being a chelik elokama mamash, doesn't need any avoda on its own to even reach
It's
these
not
highest
correct.
levels.
That's not correct.
That's not correct.
No.
Okay, I understand correctly.
If you look
Because-
chapter 2 and 3 in Tanya, talk about the Avodah of contemplating and giving birth to Midas. That doesn't just happen.
I thought
That's
that was.
Avodah.
Oh.
Let me put it this way. Does a Rebbe need Avodah?
Yes.
A pure tzaddik that is driven by Nefesh, everything comes automatic without Avodah?
No.
So,
But the idea of the midos being subjective.
They're not subjective to eating steak and other physical things, but they're still subjective in their structure. They're defined by their wiring. Even Avos Hashem can be subjective.
But the midos of a Nefesh HaLekis, subjective nature of a midos Nefesh HaLekis would be naturally towards God, I would think.
Yeah, but natural by definition is. But so what? So a Nefesh HaLekis natural subjectivity is to God. The natural subjectivity of an animal soul is to materialism. But they're both natural, and we want them to grow beyond the natural. That's the whole point here. That's what Avodah does. You want them to grow beyond just the instinctive behavioral. You want them to grow into becoming a full-bodied experience that the human being, mind, emotions have matured and developed. That's the whole point in this whole discussion.
Right, but the idea of what we're talking about, mochim the godless, bringing it down into midas, to transform the midas from subjectivity to self-preservation.
Even divine subjectivity is also seder ishtalshlus. That's what I'm explaining. Yeah, divine subjectivity would be the midas only experiencing godliness as it fits into their structure, not God that's beyond their structure. That's the whole discussion.
Divine structure, the midas. The midas are naturally. So you're talking about bringing the mochin.
You're gonna have to learn the whole. Look, what can I tell you? This is the last 20 pages all about this discussion.
I understand this about it, but I need to be clarified about Nefesh HaSichlis and Nefesh HaLekis.
The world of Atzilus is a divine world, right?
Yes, but Nefesh HaSichlis.
But it's Esesphiris. It's a structured world. It's Seder Shtalshlus. You want Atzilus to be elevated all the way to higher levels, to Keser and beyond. That's the idea.
Right. But Nefesh HaSichlis also exists does not exist in Atzilus?
He's not talking about the Nefesh HaSichlis here. Can you apply the levels of maturity in Nefesh HaSichlis? You can, but that's not what he's discussing here.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Well, how do you define Nefesh HaSichlis?
It's really not relevant to this conversation, but
I know, but
it's
he's
another
talking about
discussion
it.
that deserves its own discussion. What's the difference between Nefesh HaSichlis and Nefesh HaLekis? In Tanya, he doesn't refer to the nefesh hasichlis, remember, he only refers to two. So it really deserves its own elaboration. What is the nefesh hasichlis? Okay, we'll stop at the end of the paragraph on page 1249.